All right. Hello, Canadian Ultimate players. Can you hear me? Is the audio good? Can you hear me? The audio good? Okay, so it seems like the audio is working. All right. Welcome to our first ever live stream of the drawing of teams from pots into pools. I've never done this before live, so just bear with me if there's any problems. I'd like to thank all the teams that engaged in the schedule review process. I got some good feedback from everyone, and it was great to see the engagement from our players. So without further ado, let's just get on with it. So I'm going to start with Masters Mixed, which is up here. I'll just switch over to this tab and look here. All right, so step one for Masters Mixed is for geographic diversity. Pools A and B should attempt to balance the teams from each region. There are 6 Ontario teams, 2 Quebec teams, and 2 BC teams, and 1 Manitoba team. Thus, each division, A and B, should have 3 Ontario teams, 1 Quebec team, and 1 BC team. Since Pool A only has 5 teams, that means Manitoba's Firefly has to be in Pool B. So step 1 is to draw the teams from pot 3 one at a time and place them into the next available spot from A5, C3, and D3. So first up, going into the pot, Firefly. Can we see that? Is it? Okay, and it goes. Great. And now also in this pot is Magma Rock. And finally in this pot is Pushing Daisies. All right, so I put them all in the magic shuffler. Shake it up. And the first team out is Magma Rock. So Magma Rock goes into spot A5. All right, the next team out of the shuffler is going to be Firefly. Firefly will go into spot C3. And finally, the last one out of the pot is Pushing Daisies. They go into spot D3. All right, on to step 2. We're going to draw the teams from pot 2, place them in spots A3, C2, D2, and A4 in that order. So into pot 2 goes BOD, Dinner at 4, Forever Young, and Max Power. Put the lid on. Shuffle them up. And the first one out is, here we go, from the mixed pot 2 is BOD. BOD is the first one out. They go into spot A3. Okay, the next team out from the mixed pot 2 is Dinner at 4. They go into spot C2. And the next team out is Max Power. They go into spot D3 or D2 for Max Power. And then the last team out should be Forever Young. And it is Forever Young. All right, so that leaves the step 3, to draw teams from pot 1 one at a time, place them in the first available spot. Now we have some geographic diversity objectives here. Because both Ontario teams are in Pool B, we'll need to put both Ontario teams in Pool A1. and that leaves the Quebec team and the BC team to go into Pool B. So going into pot 1, we have Epoch, we have Happy Campers, we have Notorious KWG, and we have Reunion. Put the lid on. Okay, so if this is an Ontario team, they go into A1. If it's not, it goes into C1. So the first one is Happy Campers. You go into C1, Happy Campers. Okay, the next team out, if it's in Ontario, it goes to A1. Otherwise, it goes to D1. The next team out is Epoch. You go into D1. All right, and then we have 2 Ontario teams in here. The first one goes into A1. That's Notorious KWG, A1. Which means that Reunion should be A2. And indeed, Reunion is A2. All right, Mixed Masters is complete. Next up, we have Women's Masters. So I'll just change tabs here. All right, so for geographic diversity in the Women's Masters, no team can contain 3 teams from the same region. So we're going to start by drawing pot G1. No pool can contain 3 teams from the same region. Thank you. So we have, going into pot 1, Berta from Alberta. We have Macrame from Quebec. And we have Stello from Ontario. These teams will be seated. We'll go into spots F1, G1, and H1 in that order. Okay, first team out into F1 is Stello. Stello goes into F1. The next team out, there we go. Macrame. Macrame goes into G1. That means leftover is Berta. Berta goes into H1. Okay, and now we have a little bit of a tricky spot here for step 2. We're going to put all the teams into pot 2. We'll do that first. So we have Aguada from Quebec. We have Nebula from Ontario. We have Queen's P from Ontario. We have Sakush from Quebec. We have Solstice from Ontario. And we have Vintage from Quebec. Put the lid on. So for step 2, if the first team drawn is an Ontario team, it will be placed as G2 with Macrame. If the first team drawn is a Quebec team, it will be placed F2 with Stella. The first team drawn is Queen's P. They are from Ontario. They will be put in G2 with Macrame. Okay, so now I'm going to draw until I get a Quebec team. If I draw an Ontario team, it will go back in the. If I draw an Ontario team, it will go back in the pot until I draw a Quebec team to put with Stello. Stello. 2 came out at once. Put them back. There's one. Aguada. Aguada is a Quebec team. They can be placed in with Stello. All right, the next team drawn goes into H2 with Berta. There's one. The next team is Sakush. Sakush will be H2. All right, and now we just place the last teams in order. They will be F3, G3, then H3. First team out is Nebula. Nebula goes into F3. Okay, the next team out goes into G3. G3 is Solstice. Solstice is G3. And that means that Vintage is left, I believe. Yes, Vintage should be left. Here they are. Vintage goes into H3. Vintage. All right. So that satisfies our criteria for Women's Masters. There are not 3 teams from the same region in any pool, so we're good with that. Okay, last Masters division is the Open Masters division. So step 1 for Open Masters is to draw the teams from pot 1. From pot 1. So in pot 1 we have Carbon from Alberta. We have Dead Circus from Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia. We have Ensum from Quebec. And we have Quacks from Quebec. Being as there's 2 Quebec teams in this pot, they must be drawn into separate pools. So step 1 is to draw the team that will be placed into spot P2. So P2 is going to be Dead Circus. Dead Circus is P2. P2. All right. The next team drawn is going into N2, spot N2 for the next team. There we go. N2 is Ensum. Okay. Now there's exactly 1 Quebec team left, which means that Quacks must go in P3 and Carbon must go in N3, sorry. So we have Carbon goes into N3. And the last team out is Quacks into P3. Quacks. Okay, finally, for the last of the Open Masters, we have to draw the last 2 teams from pot 2. We have Nationals in pot 2 and Viper in pot 2. Okay, so the first team drawn goes into spot P4. P4 will be Nationals. Nationals goes into P4. Which means Viper will go into spot N4. Viper goes into spot N4. All right, and that'll conclude the Masters divisions. I'll let you take a look. All right, so now we'll move on to the senior division now. First up, senior division is this is mixed senior first. So for the draw, step 1 is to draw the teams in pot 3 into spots D4 and then C4. So the teams in pot 3 are Red Fox and Zen. So we got the teams. So first we are drawing into spot D4. D4. Team in D4 will be Zen. And that leaves Red Fox. Red Fox will go into spot C4. All right, step 2 for senior masters is to draw the teams from pot one at a time and place them into spots C2, D2, D1, C1, B1, and A1 in that order. So the teams in pot 1 are Crash. We have Force. We have Gazpacho. We have PBHG. We have Red Flag. And we have Union. Okay, so note that for this spot, because there's already one Ontario team in pot D, we can't place two more Ontario teams in D1 and D2. So after placing teams C2 and D2, if I get another Ontario team in D1, it'll move down the line to the next available spot. Also note that, what's the other note, is that also note that Red Flag and PBHG can only be in the same pool if that pool already has Zen, to make sure that there are two Ontario teams in it. So we can't have both Red Flag and PBHG in pool C. Okay, so the team in spot C2 is going to be Red Flag. Red Flag gets spot C2. Okay, next in spot D2. D2 is next. D2 has Gazpacho. All right, now D1 cannot be an Ontario team. So if I draw an Ontario team, it must skip to spot C1. I have Force. Force is an Ontario team. They must skip to spot C1. Okay, so next, again, if I get an Ontario team, it must skip to spot B1. Otherwise, we'll go in D1. The next team drawn is Union. Union will go in B1. Okay, finally we have a Crash and PBHG, so this should be PBHG and this should be Crash. There we go. We have PBHG. They will go in spot D1. And then lastly, we should have Crash. Crash. All right, now we move on to mixed pot 2. So I'm going to draw these teams one at a time and place them to spots D3, C3, and then the B pool from bottom to top and the A pool from bottom to top. Note that geographic diversity means that BC teams must be in different pools. That means I cannot place a BC team in spot C3, and I can't place 2 in B or 2 in A. And that because each pool needs two Ontario teams, C3 must be an Ontario team to give them a second Ontario team. And because the Quebec teams must be spread out, Quebec can't be in C3, but the other 2 Quebec teams can be anywhere else, but not in the same pool. All right, so let's get on with this. So the teams in pot 2 are Battleship from Quebec, We have Crank from Ontario. We have Crux from Ontario. We have Fable from British Columbia. We have Local 613 from Ontario. We have Quest from Quebec. We have Spawn from New Brunswick. And we have TT from British Columbia. Okay, so I'm drawing into spot D3. D3 cannot be an Ontario team. So if I draw an Ontario team, it must go to C3. Otherwise, the team goes to D3. Yeah, the team drawn is Crank. Crank is an Ontario team. They cannot go in D, but they can go in C. So Crank will go into a spot C3. Okay, next draw. Again, if I draw an Ontario team, it can't go in D3, so we'll go in B4. Otherwise, its team drawn goes into D3. We have TT from British Columbia. They can go into pool D with the others. Okay, the next team drawn is going into spot B4 regardless. We have Local 613 into spot B4. Local 613. Pool B is now full of Ontario. Has 2 Ontario teams, so they can't get any more. So any more Ontario teams must go into spot A4. Ontario. Yes, and so it must be Crux. Crux must go into pool A. The next team out is Fable. Fable goes into spot B3. Okay, we're out of BC teams, so this must be a Quebec team because I can't place the last 2 Quebec teams both in pool A. So if I draw a Quebec team, it will go into B2. Otherwise, it goes into A4. I have Quest. Quest will go into spot B2 from Quebec. All right, and now the last 4 teams will go into pool A from bottom to top. First up, we have Spawn. Spawn goes into A4. Next, we have Crux. Crux goes into A3. And that means the last team should be Battleship from Quebec into B2. A2, sorry. Thank you. Battleship into A2. Great. And so that concludes the senior mixed division. Next, we'll move on to the open division. Open division. All right. So step 1, draw the teams from pot 1 and place them into the top seeds in pool E and pool F. So going into pot 1, we have Furious George and we have Goat. So the first team out goes into E1, second team into F1. There we go. First team out is Furious George. Furious George goes to E1. Which will leave Goat to go into F1. Goat. All right, the next step is for geographic diversity, Blackfish must go into the F pool. They can be either F2 or F3. So let's see, the first one, if they're drawn first, F2. If they're not drawn first, they'll go F3. So going into pot 3 in the open, we have Blackfish, we have Grand Trunk, we have Hound, and we have Red Circus. All right, first team drawn goes into F2, regardless of who they are. Oh, 2 came out. Back in, stir it up. First one out is Blackfish. Blackfish goes into F2. Okay. The next team out goes into E2. 2 came out. All right, next team out is Grand Trunk. Grand Trunk goes into E2. The next team out goes into E3. The next team comes out goes into E3. There's comes Red Circus. Red Circus goes into E3. And that should mean Hound goes into F3. Hound. All right. The next step is to draw the teams in pool from pot 5. Whiskey Jacks, because there are 4 teams from Quebec, there must be 1 in each pool. Thus, Whiskey Jacks must be in G4 because these 2 teams will be Quebec teams. So teams from Quebec in pot 5 are out, and Sherbrooke Gentlemen's Club. The first team drawn will be placed into F4. F4 is first. In F4, we have Sherbrooke Gentlemen's Club. And the last team out. All right. The next step is open pot 2. So in open pot 2, we have AFC from Alberta. We have General Strike from Manitoba. We have Mephisto from Quebec. And we have Phoenix from Ontario. Okay, because Whiskey Jacks are from Alberta, AFC or Alberta Flatball Club cannot be in Pool G for geographic diversity. They must be in Pool H. So as I draw these, they will be in order G1, H1, H2, G2. If the first team drawn is AFC, it will go into H1. First team drawn is Mephisto. Mephisto goes into spot G1. All right, the next team goes into spot H1. General Strike. General Strike goes into spot H1. That means because AFC cannot go into spot G2, AFC must be H2 and Phoenix must be G2. Phoenix goes into spot G2. And AFC goes into spot H2. All right, and the last step of the open division is pot 4, which contains Shrike Regiment and Club M Manic. Because Pool G already has a Quebec team and an Ontario team, this spot cannot be Manic or Shrike. It must be Regiment. So I'll put them in right away. Regiment goes into spot G3. All right, and so that leaves Club M Manic and Shrike to be drawn into Pool H. They will be placed. They will be placed H3 first, H4 second. Shrike goes into H3. Which leaves Club M Manic to go H4. And there they are, Club M Manic. All right, and that's it for the open division. The last division is the senior women's division. J1 should be Sixers. Okay, so then the next draw is for, let's see, pot 1 will contain Iris and Traffic. These teams are being drawn for spots K1 and K2. Okay, K1 will be Iris. Which means K2 will be Traffic. Okay, and now the most interesting part of this draw is the pot 2, which contains 3 teams. It contains Fusion, contains Salty, and it contains Stella. These teams are going to be drawn J2, J3, and then K3. Okay, team J2 is Stella. Stella is J2. Team J3. J3 is Fusion. Fusion is J3. Leaving the last team in this pot is Salty, K3. Okay, next I'm going to be drawing pot 3, which is into pool spots J4 and K4. It'll contain Koi SHH and Cube. First team into J4. Cube. Cube goes into J4. Which leaves Koi into J5. Koi SHH into J5. All right, and then the last pot contains PPF and Wildish. They're going to be drawn into K4 and then K5. First team out is PPF. And then that leaves Wildish to go into K5. All right, that concludes our draw. People want to see the board? Yes, please take a look. I will update the draft schedules with these pools until the final schedules are done. I hope to finish the final schedules this weekend. Masters, there'll be some field changing from what is currently displayed, but the times and the format are not going to change. Seniors, again, times and formats shouldn't change. Fields may change after the conclusion of the Masters division.
Well, a question from Cedric Lapointe. Which days do the open pools play? Are those the Saturday pools?
These are all Saturday pools. Saturday, October 2nd, Saturday, September 25th for Masters.
That's the only question.
Great. Okay. Cedric Lapointe, Phoenix is here playing October 2nd and 3rd. This is their draw for October 2nd. Okay, if there's any more questions, quickly. Otherwise, I'll end the stream. All right, I don't see any more questions coming in. Thank you, everyone, for logging in, and I'll see you at the fields.